Alright, this is the Creating Better Arguments video. This video is the most important video that you're going to watch throughout the course of the semester. And it is that because we're going to stress creating arguments throughout the semester, and because it is a major focus of this course. Now, in terms of helping you become a better argument creator, I'm going to give you 4 major sources of guidance. The first is the Excel grading sheet. I'm going to be going over this in depth as the video progresses, and it's going to tell you what you're doing well and what you're doing poorly in terms of your argument. The second major source of guidance is the Creating Better Arguments rubric and explanation. So this, like the Excel sheet, is going to be something that is found in your reading packet, and it's going to give you detailed information about the different components of the essay, of the argument, and how to improve and tips for getting better. Finally, this video is going to be a major source of guidance, and you can turn back to this, the Excel sheet, the rubric, at any time. Finally, my office hours. Come visit me if you're struggling with something, if you're unsure about something, if you want to discuss your specific essay. That's what the hours are there for, and I hope you'll take advantage of them. Okay, now the next question is why? Why do I want to focus on creating better arguments? What's the point? Well, the point is, excuse me, that it is going to be something that lasts for the rest of your life, and it's going to be something that is beneficial to you the rest of your life. There's lots of kind of individual bits of information that you're going to forget. As a philosophy major, as somebody who's devoted my life to it, I don't remember the individual details in my philosophy undergrad classes. But I do remember core skills and practices that I gained from those classes. And in the same way, this is a skill that we're going to be working on continuously, and while you forget some of the details or many of the details of the course, this is a skill that can carry with you, can go with you for the rest of your life. It's applicable to all classes and all careers. It's not just an English thing, it's not just a philosophy thing. Regardless of which class you're taking in the university, there's going to be some element of critical thinking, some element of analysis. And in creating better arguments and getting better at that, you will gain. You'll be able to write better, you'll be able to speak better, you'll be able to formulate your opinion in more persuasive terms. And it's also good for any career. Whether you're going to be a cop or a nurse or a teacher, wherever it is that you're going into, there's going to come a point in your career where you've got to make an argument. You've got to make the case that your way of doing things or your view is better than another. Or maybe it's not even your personal view. You may have to do it on behalf of your boss or as a representative of your company. And that's a skill that you're going to get better at as a result of this class. Another reason to do it, another reason to focus on it, is contemporary students aren't that good at it. Employer surveys continuously reference the fact that they want students that can write, that can read, and that can think more critically. College students simply aren't doing that well enough for U.S. employers. So if you're able to master these skills, you're going to be able to come out of this course standing out, having something unique about yourself. And wherever you're at, you're going to get better. Whether you come in this class a terrible argument creator, that's okay. You may not leave it a great or even a good argument creator, but you're going to get better. And by working on these skills semester after semester, you can leave the university as a master argument creator, or at least a good one. And if you're good or you're great right now, that's great. We're going to improve. You're going to get better. You're going to refine your skills. So I do it because of all these benefits and because it lasts forever. It's the thing that I can give you that won't go away. And I don't do it because I enjoy making life difficult for you. Now, the grading breakdown sheet. Again, this Excel sheet, which is going to be in your reading packets. The purpose is to highlight strengths as well as weaknesses. I want to tell you as specifically as possible what you're doing well and where you need to improve. So you can build on your strengths and you can improve on your weaknesses. Now, in terms of the structure, it's broken down into major categories. Those major categories are the thesis, the transitions, the citations, the objections and rebuttals, the length, and accuracy. Now, in the first 4 of those major categories, it's broken down into 4 subcategories. And again, the purpose of doing that is to give you as specific a feedback as possible. So it's not simply like you're good or bad at thesis statements. you're good or bad at particular elements of creating a thesis. Now, within those subcategories, I'm going to grade you according to a Y, a P, or an N. Each subcategory is worth 25 points. So if, for example, you got 25 points on each section, you would end up with 100 for that category. So the Y, the P, the N. Y essentially refers to a 20 to 25 point range. It means you accomplished that subcategory. A P means you partially did it, and you can do this to a greater or less degree. So you get anywhere from a 10 or even a 5 to a 20. And then an N means that you did not accomplish that particular component, that particular subcategory. For example, did you actually create an objection or a rebuttal? If you did not, then you will receive an N for that particular component. All right, the supplement section. So the supplement section is four different categories. You can gain or lose points in these sections. Creativity, for example, you can gain points. Lack of depth, you would lose points. Phrasing and grammar, you can lose points as well. There's the abbreviation sheet, which is another component of your reading packet, and that's just another tool that I use to give you precise and as much feedback as I'm able to. Okay, so when we go into the particular components, the particular elements of creating a better argument, the first major category is the thesis statement. So a thesis statement is your goal. It's your point. It's what you want to accomplish. Now, it is the most important element of your essay. Everything is affected by the thesis statement. Every element either becomes easier and more clear as a result of the thesis statement, or with a poor thesis statement, every element becomes harder to create and master and produce and becomes less clear. And this is true regardless of whether you're talking about quotations. If you know exactly what you want to talk about, it's much easier to see if this quotation fits. It's much easier with objections and rebuttals. If you know exactly what you want to argue for, then it's easy to see what the opposing point of view is and how to respond to it. And the thesis statement is meant to help. A good thesis statement helps not only the reader or the viewer, but you as the writer or the video producer. It helps you understand exactly what you want to do, because a lot of times students really aren't sure about what it is exactly that they want to accomplish. Okay, when I look at these subcategories, the first one is, did the thesis have did the essay have a point or a goal at all? You ask yourself not only whether it had a point, but would it be clear to the reader or the viewer? Would the reader or viewer be able to tell exactly what you're trying to do? Or would they have to try to figure it out and kind of guess as to what you might be trying to accomplish? And if you struggle with the other components of the thesis statement, this particular subcategory is also going to be something that is an area where you are not doing well in. So I highly recommend using the phrase, in this essay I will. I highly recommend the phrase because, again, it forces you to thereby identify, here's what I want to do, here's what I want to accomplish, here's what I'm trying to prove. I know there's some debates about that. Some people think it's not appropriate to use the word I, to use the pronoun. Others think it's okay. I can tell you there's no clarity or no consensus in the academic world, so just do it. In this essay, I will do this, X, Y, or Z. The second component or subcategory of the thesis category grade is the point or the goal of the essay nuanced. Now, nuance essentially means you go beyond the obvious, beyond the superficial. It means you're getting into something detailed, something very specific. And a good way to ask yourself as to whether or not your thesis statement is specific is to ask yourself whether you would feel like you'd have a hard time coming up with 2 pages or coming up with 6 to 7 minutes for it. It should feel at first like it's too specific, like you're not going to be able to get the 6 to 7 minutes or the 2 full pages. And the reason it should feel that specific and too specific is because that's going to force you to get into the details of the actual essay. So, for example, if you argue that human beings are good because they are created by an all-loving God who remains present in human beings despite sin, this is a more nuanced statement than simply saying I'm going to argue that all human beings are good. In the first one, you give some specific reasons You say, here's exactly why I'm going to argue for my position. And so that's another good tip. It's another good way to check as to whether you are being specific. Did you give a specific single reason as to why you are arguing for your position? Okay, the third subcategory is there's only one major argument to be developed. Now, you have to think again here, is there a specific single point? You don't want to use phrases or produce the sense that there's multiple reasons that you're going to make your argument. Give me what you want to argue for, give me one single reason you're going to argue for that, and that's it. Focus just on that. Again, it'll feel too specific, but that's going to help you in the end. If there's multiple statements that could serve as a thesis statement, then you are going to get a lower mark in this section. Finally, is the thesis statement an argument rather than a description of a fact? If it's a fact, then there's no reason to argue for it. If it's an argument, then you've got to bring in all the different elements. You've got to have evidence. You've got to have quotations. You've got to have an objection. You've got to have a rebuttal. You've got to prove to the reader or the viewer that your position is correct. If it's simply a fact, then you know you're off base. Finally, you want to try to be consistent, especially in this first paragraph, because a lot of times students will create a thesis statement that is inconsistent with what went before. It's one of the biggest mistakes that students make. And in that case, it becomes harder for the reader or the viewer to tell, okay, again, is this the major point? Or are they trying to do something else? Are they unsure about what they're trying to accomplish? Okay, the second major component is this notion of transitions. So with transitions, think of yourself as a guide rather than an explorer. Because the first subcategory is, did the ideas flow together, or were they a series of independent, separate thoughts? The explorer goes into an argument kind of grasping at straws. This might be a good idea. This might be a good way to go. This might be a way to prove my argument. This might be a way to object to it. Whereas the guide is showing the reader or viewer exactly how their arguments fit together. And so when we talk about flow, when I talk about flow, did the paragraphs relate to one another? Is there a reason that one paragraph follows from another? Or again, are they separate, independent thoughts? Was there a central argument or theme around which all the statements made related? Were they revolving around a single idea? Were there multiple, kind of different, distinct ideas that were occurring? You want to avoid, in terms of flow, contradictory statements or ideas. So, for example, it means you don't say something is good in one paragraph and bad in another. It doesn't mean you say, this is my position in one paragraph and I'm going to take a different position in a different paragraph. Now, we're going to get to objections and rebuttals later. You can introduce that different idea, but you have to introduce it clearly. And contradictory statements, what they do is they essentially disrupt the flow. They make the reader or the viewer go back and say, okay, what exactly was the author trying to do here? Or the speaker trying to do here? And then you have to go back, you have to try to figure it out. Whereas a good flowing essay and a good flowing argument, the reader just goes along with it. The viewer understands, okay, here is what is happening. Finally, flow is greatly enhanced by transition words. And in the Creating Better Arguments rubric, an explanation in your reading packet, I give you a website that has lots of good transition words. Look at that site, review it. If you're not using these words, your essay probably is going to suffer. These transition words really, again, guide the reader or viewer. They help show the reader or viewer how the ideas connect to one another. And they also help you to see what you're doing. Do the ideas in the argument consistently refer back to the thesis, the second subcategory? Are you consistently and clearly developing your thesis? Again, this is why the thesis statement is so critical. It affects so many different aspects of your essay. If you're writing something that does not support and help you develop your thesis, then it should be out. And by helping you develop your thesis, that isn't simply things that agree with your thesis. It could also be the objection, the point of view that disagrees. But if it is not helping you develop your argument, if it's not helping you get further depth, then it has no place. It may be interesting, it may be a cool idea, but it has no place in this particular argument. Does each paragraph, the third subcategory, have a central idea that was being developed? Okay, so within each paragraph, Do the ideas fit together? For example, if you're offering evidence on behalf of your argument, then the paragraph should be all about that piece of evidence. It shouldn't have evidence in one part of the paragraph, an objection in another, a rebuttal in the third. If you're having a paragraph about evidence, make it about that evidence, and that's it. So that's one way to fail, that you have really distinct, distinguished, separated ideas that are disconnected from one another, that are independent from one another. The next way you can fail is you could have a basic theme in that paragraph, but have multiple ways you're trying to attack that theme. For example, if you have an evidence paragraph, you could have multiple pieces of evidence that should be developed either separately in different paragraphs, or one single piece of evidence that is just developed fully. So as a general rule of thumb, so this is a grading tip, if there are 3 or more paragraphs where the distinctly different components of the argument are offered, then you would receive an N for this component. And again, the common example of distinctly different would be if you're offering evidence and then an objection, or an objection and rebuttal in the same paragraph. If you're consistently kind of making minor flaws in this, in the sense that you've got a basic theme but multiple ways you're attacking it, that would also lose you points. And here's a tip. After you finish writing or making your argument on video, can you tell what specifically each paragraph is doing? You write in one word. Could you write it down? Here's the main idea. Okay, the final thing is the author proposed an objection and rebuttal. So students, one of the biggest mistakes they make is that you offer an objection but you don't introduce it as an objection. If you're introducing a point of view that disagrees with your own, tell the reader or viewer, this is coming from another source. If you don't use proper phrases such as, someone might argue, an objection to my position is, from another point of view, if you're not using those words, those phrases that help the reader or viewer see, okay, this is something else. This is not the reader or viewer's own position, but it's the position they're going to consider as an objection, then you're going to struggle here. And so ask yourself, not only whether you offered an objection or rebuttal, but did you offer it clearly? All right, the next piece of information, and you could also lose points in here. For example, if you offer an objection but not a rebuttal. So you got to do both. The next component is the citations section of the reading packets and the Excel grade sheets. Okay, so citations. Citations are quoting. And quotation is absolutely essential. It's important to any kind of good argument because it shows that you're able to, what I call, have a conversation with the text. It shows that you're able to kind of link your ideas, your opinions, your thoughts to that of the other author, or if you're using a video, that of the speaker. It allows you to interpret, you connect your ideas with that of another, and often an expert. Someone who's thought about this issue much more than you have. And so then by interacting with this person who's thought about this issue likely much more than you have, you're able to kind of say, okay, here's how I fit in. Here's how my ideas work with this position. Okay, and so that's very important. Again, a conversation with the text. It's not simply all quotes, it's not simply all your ideas, it's an interchange. And here's another way to avoid a kind of a common misperception of philosophy. A lot of times people will say philosophy, it's just all opinion. You can argue whatever you want. And I'm not going to judge your opinion as either bad or wrong on its own. But you can make a bad argument, you can make a bad interpretation. And so having quotes helps you at least begin to show the reader or viewer that, okay, here's the position that I'm analyzing, and then the reader or viewer can judge whether you've done it well or done it poorly. Okay, we look at the subcategories of the citation sheet. Did the argument use at least 3 quotes? So the first 2 subsections are related to one another. The second subsection is the argument used at least 3 quotes directly from class material, not including class notes or emails. So, for example, if you use at least 3 quotes from class material, you would get a Y for both of these marks. But just having 3 quotes on its own is not enough, in the sense that if you use 3 quotes from outside of class material, from Wikipedia or from another source, from another book perhaps that you're using in another course, that's great. I encourage it. I love it. Bring in outside sources. That's wonderful. But if you just use outside sources, you could get, I want to give you credit for that, you would get perhaps a Y on this if you brought in 3. But if you didn't use any class material, again, class text and class videos, then you get an N for that second. So that should be clear, and doable. Were the quotes relevant to the argument? So the only way that a quote is relevant to your argument, if it either supports or challenges your specific thesis. If it doesn't do either, it is not relevant. It should not be included. Get it out. Again, it may be interesting, but it's not relevant here. So again, your quote can either support, give evidence for your position, or challenge it. Be part of the objection to your position. Oftentimes that's wonderful if you use a quote as an objection, because then you're saying to the viewer reader, here's what the expert in the field thinks, but I'm ultimately going to prove that expert wrong, or at least argue why they're wrong. If it's not relevant, then it's not, you're not going to get full credit here. And part of relevancy is explaining the quote. Don't just assume that the reader or the viewer understands what you're saying or that the quote is self-explanatory. No. Show the reader exactly how the quote fits in, exactly what the quote is doing, exactly how it fits into your argument. Now, if you use purely definitional quotes, like utilitarianism is this, you wouldn't get full credit for the relevancy section. You get nearly full credit, but a lot of times if you're just using definitional quotes, they don't help you develop your argument in interesting ways. And so avoid just using definitional quotes. Use quotes that help you develop your ideas in new, unique, important ways. All right, the last section, the last subcategory. Did the author quote properly? Did you use quotation marks? This is the biggest component of this area. If you don't use quotation marks, oftentimes it becomes very ambiguous as to whether you're actually quoting. Maybe you're quoting, maybe you're paraphrasing, but paraphrasing does not count as quoting for this component of the essay and the argument. Very clear. Paraphrasing does not count as quoting. If all you do is paraphrase, then you're going to get an N for this part of your argument grade, and you get a 0 overall. So you need to quote. And again, quotation marks say exactly, okay, here, with the quotation marks, what's within here are not my own words. They're the words of another. And so definitely use quotation marks. I don't care about what particular style you use, whether you use APA or Chicago Manual. That's not overly important to me. What I do care about is use quotation marks, and in some way you identify for the reader or viewer where this information is coming from. What book, what text, what video, and what page number. Okay, so you have that. Objections and rebuttals. This is the next major grading component of your argument grade. Now, this is the component where students tend to struggle the most. This is the component where students really, a lot of times, they're not sure how to do it. And I want to offer you kind of a way to think about it. It's a sports analogy. And so, think about, in sports, as the offensive team, you're trying to score. You're trying to put the puck in the net, or the ball in the hoop, or the goal, or whatever. That's you making your argument. You offering evidence for your argument. You as the offense are trying to prove that your point is right. Now, when you are the defense, you're trying to stop the offensive player. You're trying to prevent them from scoring. And this is where an objection is introduced. So think of the objection as kind of the defense. The defense trying to stop you from scoring, and we put it in terms of argument creation. The defense is the position of someone who objects to you, who doesn't agree with you, who wants to say that your thesis, your idea, is wrong. And finally, as offense, you've got to counteract that defense. You've got to counterattack. And that's your rebuttal. That's you coming back and saying, no, my argument is in fact correct, and here is why the objection is wrong. Okay. So did the author articulate an objection to his or her thesis? That's the first component. The objection comes from the perspective, again, of someone who thinks that you are wrong, someone who does not agree with your argument. You've got to put yourself in the shoes of your opponent, and that's oftentimes what is most difficult for students. Your grade on this component will depend upon whether you've created an objection and whether it, in fact, is clear. Or does the author, does the reader, viewer have to kind of figure it out? Okay, is this possibly an objection? Is this possibly how the author or viewer or reader is disagreeing with him or herself? Or is it clear? If you have multiple objections with no clear kind of individual main objection, then you could also lose points for this. Finally, have you created an objection specifically related to your thesis? If it's a disagreement, but it's not specifically related to your thesis, then it's not really an objection to your thesis. For example, here's an example thesis statement. I argue that the Sixers are the most intriguing sports team in Philadelphia. The objection to that can't be, well, sports in general aren't intriguing. That's an objection to a different thesis statement. That's an objection to the statement that sports are intriguing. If I'm going to make an objection to that thesis statement, the one I just made, I've got to say, well, the Sixers are not the most intriguing sports team in Philadelphia, either because they're not that intriguing or because there's another team that is more intriguing. Again, use phrases such as, someone might argue an opposing point of view is, on the other hand. Next subcategory. Did the author develop a significant objection? A paragraph, 5 to 7 sentences, specifically related to a single objection, as opposed to a paragraph where there's multiple objections, or a paragraph where there's 1 or 2 sentences about the disagreement. Put yourself in the other shoes of your opponent and develop that argument, that objection, that view of your opponent fully, at least 5 to 7 sentences. Okay. The next 2 components, so the rebuttal, is essentially the same thing. The rebuttal is you answering the objection, and again, you're going to want to answer it specifically. You're not going to want to have just a rebuttal in general, but a specific reason as to why the objection is wrong. And you can use phrases such as response to, as a counterpoint to return to my argument, etc. And just like the objection, the 4th subcategory is, was the rebuttal developed fully? Again, a separate 5 to 7 sentence paragraph just focused on your rebuttal. A lot of times students think that the conclusion is the rebuttal. No, the conclusion is summing up your argument. The rebuttal is you responding specifically to the objection in a separate paragraph and doing it fully. Okay, as a tip in terms of creating an objection, put yourself in the shoes of another by asking yourself, by reading it from the perspective of someone who hates you, someone who wants to see you fail, someone who doesn't want your argument to win, to be correct. Reading it from the perspective that hates you helps you see where your argument is weak, and at those weak points, you can potentially create an objection. And then finally, another kind of tip. If you're comparing things, here's where you got to be really careful. Because in comparative essays, it can oftentimes be difficult to create an objection. At least clearly. So for example, if I argue that black raspberry is a better flavor of ice cream than vanilla, and in one paragraph talks about how black raspberry is so wonderful, then the objection is not saying vanilla is terrible, because that simply contributes to my thesis. I'm saying in the thesis black raspberry is better. The objection would have to be something like, black raspberry isn't better than vanilla, or black raspberry isn't that great, or vanilla really is wonderful. That's where the objection comes. The objection would come in disputing the comparison that you want to make. Okay, so those are the major categories, and the major categories with subcategories. There's 2 other major categories that don't have subcategories that would be graded from 0 to 100. The accuracy of interpretation. So what is being judged here is not whether you properly replicated the structure of an argument, whether you had a thesis, and evidence, and quotations, and an objection and rebuttal. Because you can have a well-structured argument that is nonetheless inaccurate. Again, going back to something I said earlier in the video, I don't care what your opinion is. You can have whatever opinion you want, make an argument for it. But you can misinterpret the text. So did you misunderstand the main ideas or core concepts that we discussed in class or that were present in the text or the video that you're using. If you did, then you are going to struggle in this accuracy portion of it. But again, just replicating the proper structure isn't enough. You've got to be able to accurately interpret the information. And the example I give in the grading rubric is, someone could argue the moon is made of cheese. They could have evidence for it. They could have quotes. They could have an objection, a rebuttal, well structured, but a misinterpretation of just basic facts. In the same way, you can misinterpret basic facts or the position of a particular author. You can agree or disagree with any author that you want, any idea that you want, but you got to get the idea right first. You first have to understand what you are disagreeing with or agreeing with. Okay, so general rule of thumb, 2 or more major misinterpretations would lead to a low mark, whereas multiple minor misinterpretations would cumulatively add up to a low mark. The length, the next and last major component. This one should be pretty self-explanatory. It has to be at least 2 pages long. It should not go more than 3.5 pages. Use the traditional font, 12-point font, no crazy off-the-cuff fonts, 1-inch margins, so on and so forth. Your video should be at least 6 to 7 minutes. It should not go beyond 10 minutes, so within that kind of range, you're good. And finally, a tip. If you read the perspective of someone that hates you, this is going to be a way that you are able to identify weak points of your arguments and thereby address them, thereby get greater length. And also, if you have accomplished all the other areas of the argument, if, for example, you have quotes and you've explained them, you have an objection that is fully developed, and a separate paragraph of a fully developed rebuttal, generally you're going to do well. You're going to be able to get the 2 pages because you have all these components present. I'm going to end the video with this, what I call supplement section. So creativity. You can earn anywhere from 1 to 3 points in this component if your argument goes beyond the obvious. If you do something, if you present something in a way that makes the reader of yours say, oh, wow, that's interesting. It's a new way of looking at it. I wouldn't have thought that. Phrasing and grammar. A lot of times students complain, they say, this isn't an English class. Phrasing and grammar isn't important, it's just for an English class. Here's the problem. You can lose up to 5 points depending upon the quality of your grammar and phrasing. Your grammar and phrasing either communicates your core ideas well and clearly, or it obscures your core ideas and makes them harder to understand and harder to identify. And that harms your argument. And it harms you both in an academic sense as well as professionally. I can guarantee you, people will judge how you speak and how you write. And if you speak or write poorly, you will be judged as someone who's uneducated, unintelligent, as someone who is not capable oftentimes of doing the job asked of them. So it is important. It does affect you. And academically, it affects you for the reasons I just mentioned. It obscures the point of your argument. Now, there's 2 major ways you can lose points here. Either, everybody makes grammatical mistakes, and I make them, and it's, I'm not going to be a stickler about that. But it's the consistency of mistakes that really matter. Because consistent mistakes either indicate that you got to go back and really work on the core elements of your phrasing and grammar, or it indicates that you're sloppy, you're lazy, you haven't taken the time to proofread, or you haven't given it to someone to proofread. And so the consistency there will lose points. You could also lose points if your phrasing and grammar obscures your ideas. If the reader of you has to go back and say, okay, what were they saying exactly? What do they mean? Because again, that distracts, that disrupts your argument. The tip, have someone who speaks or writes well review your essay. The next supplement, lack of depth. You can lose up to 5 points here. Lack of depth essentially means superficiality. You're not going beyond the obvious. You're not getting into the details. So when you're discussing something in very broad terms, that's where you could lose points. And oftentimes this occurs, and again, this is a tip. If you have 3 major pieces of evidence, 3 separate, distinct pieces of evidence that you want to argue for your points, and you try to cram them all into a 2-page essay, a lot of times that's not going to allow you to be detail-oriented. It's going to leave you being very superficial. So, for example, if I argued that the Sixers are the most intriguing team in Philadelphia because they have Joel Embiid, a potential superstar, they have the best in-court entertainment, or maybe they're just better, more interesting than the other three teams. Those are three distinct, different ideas. I should develop one of those ideas, and then I can get some real depth. But if I try to include them all, I'm not going to have depth, and I'm going to lose points here. You could also lose points for having too many objections, too many rebuttals, rather than a single rebuttal or a single objection developed fully. Finally, late. So if your argument is late, you're going to lose 7.5 points per week that it is late. So 7.5 points per week that it is late. So get it in. And even if it's late, better to turn it in than get a 0. The final point of this argument is plagiarism. Plagiarism is when you essentially steal the ideas of another, and you essentially steal them because you're passing off these ideas as if they are your own when they are really not. A good tip here is go back and reread your essay or go back and view your video. And if you can't tell that these words are coming from another source, then you are likely guilty of plagiarism. Best way to avoid it is use quotation marks. Use quotation marks. Best way to do it, or if you're doing a video, say, here is the video, or here is the text that I'm using from page whatever. Here's what the author says. When you don't use quotation marks, you put yourself in jeopardy of plagiarism. Okay, so that is the video. That's all the different components, and this video is going to help you review it. You're going to review different pieces of it throughout the semester for quizzes, but also review it every time that you create an argument. All right, have a great day, and I look forward to the arguments that you'll make.